Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment's virtual town hall series, presented by the COVID-19 Readiness Resource Project. My name is Emily Kosick, and I am the Knowledge Manager at CIPSRT. Our topic today is stress and emergency management. We're going to have a presentation, followed by a chance for you to ask your questions of our panelists and the presenter. If you have a question, you can use the question box throughout the presentation to send it to us, and we'll make sure we get it answered. Just a reminder that the town hall is being recorded, so if you miss something, you can watch it again later. A note, CIPSRT does not have permission to share the PowerPoint presentation. Please contact the individual presenter if you have any questions. Now, let me introduce our panelists and presenter for today. First, we have Jennifer Wood, the manager for Grand Prairie Emergency Partnership. Then, we have Josh Bowen, manager of the Center for Applied Disaster and Emergency Management at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. Our last presenter is Jason Shaw, who is the Assistant Chief of Emergency Management for the City of Winnipeg. Our presenter today is Jeff Sitch. He's a registered psychologist and the Clinical Director at the Alberta Critical Incident Provincial Network. Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you to begin the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Emily. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to present on this topic of stress in emergency service personnel. As Emily said, my work is largely with people that are in emergency services, and I mostly focus on the effects of stress and building resilience, as well as discussing the impact after events happen to keep people healthy. And just want to put up the disclaimer here saying that what I am presenting on is an evidence-informed practice for coping with stress as well as current research. So what I'm going to talk about today is what is stress? What does it look like? The 3 R's of stress, which we'll get to in a couple of moments. Strategies for coping with stress, and then looking at the benefit of either a proactive or reactive stress program. So one of the things that we do know is that over the course of the last 60 to 70 years, we have a lot of research on what stress is, but more so that focus has been on the physical effects of stress. Only in the last 20 years has the research really focused on the psychological impact and the effects that stress has on our nervous system, including what we call neurotoxicity. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today. I just noticed that the French translations on the slide are not present, but I'm going to keep going. I do have a copy of the slides that will have the French translations on them for anybody that's interested. So what is stress? So first of all, stress is the fight, flight, or freeze response. It really is our body's way of preparing for adversity. It is the ability to respond to adverse impacts, adversity. And these words are really synonymous: worry, stress, anxiety, and fear. And what they really are about is the level at which our body is escalated. So worry is probably people perceive it or feel it as a less intense form of stress, where fear or panic is much more, that the symptoms are quite higher, quite a lot higher. But what it really comes from is that stress, and whichever word we use, is about the anticipation of something bad happening. And that anticipation, whether it is seeing a bear running towards you or thinking that a bear is running towards you, produces the same physiological and cognitive changes as if that is happening. And what we do know is that in order to overcome that adversity, our body changes in order to activate this fight, flight, or freeze response. It actually is meant for very short-term responses. But in this day and age, what we're finding is most people's stress response stays active for long periods of time, years, sometimes even a whole life. And over time, what we see is what is meant to be a short-term adaptive process to get away from something adversive or dangerous, when put and sustained on for a long period of time, starts to see changes in personality, our physical health, our performance, our behaviors, and we have studies now that shows that it changes our brain. So let's just talk a little bit about the stress response. So the blue line that is on the screen represents the amount of stress that is required in order to perform basic duties, basic responses in life. So this is about getting up, getting to work, maybe it's dealing with the kids. It's meeting life's normal requirements, its normal demands. And what happens in the stress response is that the alarm system goes off. So our brain interprets some stressor or some stimulus as being dangerous to us. And our body creates a complete response. It's a chemical response that affects not only our brain, but our body, that prepares us for this fight or flight response. And this resistance phase, the yellow phase, is where our body and brain continue to use those responses in order to stay alive, in fact, to avoid that dangerous adversive situation. And in a normal situation, when the danger is over, the orange line sort of comes into play, which is our body resets. Those chemicals, our physiology, our psychology resets itself, and it replenishes all of those hormones and energy that was used so that we can recover and return back to that blue line. But in emergency management, a lot of individuals come out of their normal daily duties, meaning the things that they do with the blue line, whether it is some sort of operation within their municipality, within the company that they work, that emergency management is outside their normal duties that they're called into. And the calling in to the ECC or the disaster, the emergency, is really that activation alarm. And then the whole time that the emergency is going on, people are actually operating in that yellow line. And I want you to think about your own experience about how long are you in that emergency situation? Are you responding to it? Are you preparing for it? And while you may not be front line, putting out the fire, dealing with the flood, dealing with the threat in the community, you are back in an operations center in a duty that has a lot of responsibility, stress, those sorts of things, where you are operating at that yellow line. Your body is in the fight, flight, danger, adversity response mode. And I wonder, how long is it realistic to be able to hold yourself at that level without feeling that level of exhaustion or starting to have that negative effect? So what does stress look like? We use this word, we use it pretty generically. We use it all the time. I'm really stressed, or that caused me stress. But what do we really mean? Well, stress really is, it affects us in 5 domains. And just let me tell you a little bit about what happens. What our research has shown over the last 60, 70 years, and I'm really proud to say that the research on stress started at McGill University with Dr. Selle. So we started understanding stress in Canada, in a Canadian institution, and most of the information is derived out of that foundational research. So from a physical point of view, our body responds in a way to shut down the wasteful energy that might be used to digest food or to reproduce or those sorts of things, so that the energy can go to the muscles, to the system that will let us fight or fight, flight or fight. Then what happens is it changes our thinking. It sharpens our cognition, it lowers our threshold for sound, light, really input, and it creates almost this flashbulb memory. It changes our emotional response, and then we start to see behaviors change in our relationship to the world. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail into each one of these domains now. So from a physical point of view, as I said, the chemical changes in your body in response to stress, when you go from that blue line up to that yellow line that I just showed you, is that the body says, what energy am I wasting on things that don't matter? And it conserves the energy so that it can send that energy to the muscles and the parts of your body, the heart, the lungs, so that it can send that energy so that you can fight or flight. So if you respond to stress in really usual ways, most people say, oh, my stomach is upset. Well, what's really happening is, as you can see on this diagram, our stomach and our gut changes in that it slows down. It reduces the amount of energy that it's putting into it. People describe stress as increasing their cardiovascular. Maybe it's heavier breathing, or it is that their heart is beating faster or stronger. And that is that, again, sending the energy so that we can get away from the threat. Now we move over to the cognitive side of the slide here. And what happens is, in an emergency, our brain believes that if we focus, if we sharpen our attention to what the perceived threat is, it will keep us safe. It's sort of like put the eye on the ball. Don't take the eye off of that one thing. So our brain eliminates distractions. It focuses on that one danger or that one perceived danger. It makes us really in tune with the environment. So we know that our sight, the sound, even our skin conductivity, nervous system becomes sort of alert, almost like a smoke detector coming alive. And it really believes, it does a really weird thing, that it believes that if I can lock in a memory about this danger, that in the future I will be able to remember that memory to stay safe again. And the way that I sort of describe it is that if we were on the Serengeti as cavemen and we had to learn that saber-toothed tigers were dangerous and going to eat us, it would be really dangerous to try to domesticate them and bring them into our cave. So what it did is it taught us to respond to our environment, to be aware of danger, and that when we did actually perceive the threat, it was important to lock that in so we wouldn't keep going towards the edge of the cliff, the poisonous food, or the dangerous animal. So that flashbulb memory is really, really important from an evolutionary point of view as to warning us about the future threats. But in modern man, it can actually provide a lot of problematic areas. Again, we're talking about perceived threats versus maybe real threats. Now we get to the emotional aspect. And we have this little part of our brain that is our emotional smoke detector. It takes information from what's going on in our environment around us, and it creates this emotional response. So fear is an emotional response that tells us there's a danger, that activates all of these these systems in our body and releases these chemicals in order to create this fight, flight, or freeze response. But if we look at other emotions, whether it be anger, whether it be sadness, guilt, or shame, it really is our body and our brain picking up what's going on in the environment and preparing us for action. So once we have a physiological or physical change in our body, our thinking changes and our emotions are impacted, then we start to see behavioral changes. And I wish I could have a really all-encompassing list of the behaviors that we see change in response to stress, but here's a few common ones that we see. But what I would ask you to do is, as you're watching this webinar or even afterwards, what are some of the behaviors that you see that change in you when stress level are high? And if you can create a couple of points about what shows up in your body and what shows up in your behavior to tell you you're stressed, you're actually already starting to build that resistance to future stress. So what we know is that when people are stressed because of these chemical changes in our body, one of the things that happens is our eating habits change. We probably don't crave healthy food. We go into the carbohydrates and probably the salty, sugary foods because that's what our body is trying to convincing us we need to almost give it more energy. What we start to see is a change in sleep. And again, some people are unable to sleep at all. And some people, they just have no energy and they feel like they need to sleep all the time. We see people that start to do behaviors that engage in sort of what we call numbing behaviors. That rather than turning the stress off, which may not always be possible, what we see people is artificially turning it off by using numbing techniques. And that can be everything from alcohol to prescription drugs, as well as maybe some numbing behaviors like either gambling or internet or those sorts of things as well. It's used to escape the stressor, to try to shut off that response. Doesn't really do a good job of shutting off the response. It just sort of detaches us from it for a while. What we also notice is that when we are stressed, we find it difficult because the sense of arousal that we're at, we just don't want to be around other people. So we see ourselves starting to isolate or distance ourselves. So those are some of the most common behavioral response, but in no means are they actually all encompassing. And your work after watching this is to go and make a list of what you recognize in yourself, or even ask the people that you live with, what do you notice I do differently when I'm stressed? And create a little bit of a list about that, and that can be really helpful in the future. So now we come to the fifth and final domain of what changes in response to stress, and it really is what we call the spiritual aspect. And I think the icon on the slide really says it, which is it's our change in how we relate to the world. It's not necessarily about an entity or a deity or a god. It really is our relationship to the greater, to the larger aspect of the world that we live in. Maybe we call it existential. But when people are going through stressful times, when they're going through a threat or a perceived threat, what we start to see is a change in how we relate to the world. And we call this a shift in worldviews. So maybe we grew up believing that good things happen to good people, but because in your emergency management role, you're really exposed to things that challenge that belief, and you start to see the world as being a bad things happen to good people. So we're looking for those changes in worldview, the ability for trust, safety, power, control, and self-esteem. So what are some of the unique stresses in emergency management? Well, first of all, there are the operational aspects. These are the things that people are exposed to in the line of the work that they do. And unfortunately, what often happens is because emergency managers are called out of a normal role, they might have some disaster emergency preparation, that really what the exposure is may be new or novel to them. It's something that they've trained for but don't necessarily always immerse themselves in. And some of the operations, what people are called upon to do, can really have an impact on them. There are always organizational aspects as well, that oftentimes that some of the ways that organizations operate can unwittingly cause stress. And we start to see things like different rules apply to different people, a lack of input into decisions, really a lack of being able to contribute. We start to see moral injuries as well. And moral injuries are really defined as when what you know about the world, the job, the operation comes in conflict with what you're asked to do, comes in conflict with what you believe you should be doing. And that is a level of stress and emergency management that often goes unnoticed or unrecognized until now. One of the examples that I might give you is in an emergency. Maybe you are asked to do something that affects the community that you live in what you believe is a destructive way. Maybe you're having to make the decisions about evacuating and or creating a line by bulldozing some infrastructure or houses, and those are the people that you know that live there. And that conflict between what you're asked to do in your emergency management role versus what or how you would normally treat these people can put you into a conflict. We know that past experiences can also create an increased risk of this stress response. And if you think about an organization that has gone through emergency in the past, and maybe within a couple of years or even the next year, that same emergency happens. And I know in Alberta, floods, fire, those recurring over every year and some of the same communities being affected, those in emergency management are called upon sort of year after year or a couple of years in a row and that just re-escalation of something that they've already been through can also increase that stress response. As I alluded to in the moral injury part, I want to talk about the personal meaning as well. I think that emergency management creates a unique challenge in that most often emergency managers are working either in the community, the corporation, the environment upon which they live or work that is usually seen as a safe place, or that there is a connection to on a personal level, either the people, the place, or what they do, or even the source of income. And we know that anything that we're exposed to that has a personal meaning, anything that is an emergency, a disaster, that is stressful, that has a personal meaning, also has the ability to increase our reaction to it. So what do we do? Well, the other aspects of emergency management that are really important is looking at personal resilience. Are the people that we're calling upon to do these roles in emergency management, do they come to the job with that personal resiliency? How do they normally cope with stress? What do they do to normally stay healthy? But if we extrapolate that to the organization as well, does the organization cope well with stress? Does it have plans in place? Does it have that ability to bounce back? Those can really impact the amount of stress that we see in emergency management as well. And then finally, that ability of the community to bounce back. I think that we have inherently seen some communities, maybe not within Canada, but that we see that are less resilient, that they are constantly battered, exposed to traumatic events or crises, and they never seem to recover from it, and another one happens. And that community's ability to sort of rise up to overcome that emergency can really put an additional pressure on emergency management. So these are the unique stresses that we see for individuals that work in this emergency management field. They're by no means exhaustive. They're just the ones that we understand that can be the most impactful. So what are the 3 R's of stress? Well, the first one is resistance, second one is resilience, and the third one is recovery. And in preparing for this the slide presentation, the best analogy that I can give you is that imagine for a moment that a tornado was coming through Edmonton, where I'm presenting from. Well, it wouldn't make sense for me to start renovating and adding on to my house during the time of that threat appearing on the horizon. What it would actually make more sense for me to do is to batten down the hatches, to make sure that everything is locked in place, that everything is secure. So resistance is really being able to say, is my house built in a way that can withstand the danger that it poses? And if we use that analogy to the person, what it says is, does the person have the resistance to prepare to be able to face the stress? Resilience is the ability to bounce back. So after the storm is over, how quickly do we clean up and sort things out to get back into our normal routine, our normal healthy routine? That's what we call resiliency. And then recovery is, well, what if there's damage done? What if I need to do some repairs? Do I know where to go, where to get the expert that might need to help me with the fixing, or to give me some information as to how to go about it? So having a plan and knowing where to go is really important as well. And it really is no different from either a physical medical point of view, from a practical recovery point of view. But people fail to recognize from a psychological point of view that this principle still holds. We accept that during flu season, maybe not COVID-19, but flu season, that if we go and get a flu shot, we build resistance to that year's flu strain. That if the flu morphs and our inoculation isn't effective, if we're healthy, if we eat healthy or sleeping, if our body is healthy, even if we get the flu, we will bounce back quicker. And then for those of us who maybe immunity is down, maybe we're tired, maybe the flu impacts us more, knowing where to go to get treatment, knowing where to go and get that assessment in advance of the flu is also healthier. And it strikes me that we really don't apply these concepts to our mental wellness as well. because they really do apply this idea of resistance, resiliency, and recovery. So what do we do to manage the stress? Well, I wish I could tell you that this slide is going to transform your life, that it's going to tell you some magical thing that you're going to be able to do. But what I want to really point out here is some of the key things I want you to consider. So first of all, what we know in response to stress is that our body creates a chemical response. It releases a whole bunch of chemicals, including cortisol. And what that does is it actually works to suppress growth, suppress digestion, suppress reproduction. It suppresses immunity, and it turns off all those building projects that are going on in our body in order to respond to the stress. And what we want to do is the stress management techniques, we want to burn off some of those chemicals. We want to burn off some of those stress responses. And a really good way of doing that is by burning it off with some form of physical activity. The other thing that we want to do is we want to do something that really deactivates the system. If we put more energy into a system that's already overloaded with chemicals that are exacerbating that energy, such as caffeine, then we can actually make that response worse. So reducing the stress hormones through doing some sort of getting your body in motion. Then if we focus on the physiological response, which is how do we sort of calm that energy in our body down, we know that yoga, deep breathing, distracting with healthy pursuits such as music or those sorts of things can be healthy as well. And then from a psychological response, our brain is sharpened to focus on the perceived threat. So if we shift our focus to something that maybe in the past has brought us some relaxation or some sort of positive response, it can give us a bit of a vacation or a break from the stressor. And then if we're able to make a decision with regards to our coping behaviors as to whether or not they are adaptive behaviors or maladaptive, are they coping with the stress? And I mean that those 5 symptoms in our body, or are they masking and or distracting from the stress? Are they helping us get through the situation? Or are they perpetuating the problem? We want to make sure that we are reacting with behaviors that have been shown to be effective in that stress response. Now, I really want to talk about this proactive versus reactive stress before we leave. If we are faced with stress and we try to find our way through it after these symptoms have already escalated, it's going to be a far more difficult journey than if we have a plan in place. So a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals really focus on a reactive system. We're going through the stressful time. It's impacting people's physiological health, psychological health, and oh my God, we need to do something. Well, we're way too late. That actually this inoculation, proactive resiliency building actually is the best course of action. And it's far easier to reconnect to something that you've already had in place. And so I really like this saying that's on the slide, which is that really building without a foundation is really soon to be demolished. So if we take that time, especially people that work in or might be called in to deal with disasters, emergencies, and manage them, making sure that they have that ability to cope with stress in place first will actually help them stay healthier and reconnect to those signs when they're going through stress. So what do? What are some of the systems that we know work in emergency management? Well, I just said to you, resiliency training, which is being able to teach people how to bounce back during times of stress. But the worst time that we could do that is when the stress is already upon us. And I use the analogy of the tornado coming, and we don't want to be constructing a house to take shelter in as that weather's coming towards us. We want to have a shelter in place, and that's really what resiliency training is. We know that social connectedness is hugely important in being able to dampen down the effects of stress, helping our body and our mind reset. And then having a place that if we still are impacted by stress, knowing where to go and what to do, having that in place, having a guideline, almost having a pathway for people to go that we know works in place before the crisis, the stress, is really helpful. The worst time to figure out where to go to get help is when you're in the middle of needing the help. So as we close, I want to give you a little example as to what the research has said. So we know that there's been publications that have said that there's certain things that people can do to help them cope with stress. So the first one is when we look at studies as to how organisms are affected by stress, here's what we find. And believe it or not, rat brains and mouse brains are actually very similar to human brains. So a lot of the studies are done on animals to figure out how they respond to stress. And we know, and this is what Selle did in McGill probably 60 years ago, is looked at the effects of stress. So what they looked at is how do we stress out these animals and see whether or not what they do to adapt is helping them through the situation or not. So the first thing that we found out that if you put an animal and stress it out and it's got no outlets for its stress, it actually starts to die. But if we put a second animal into that cage, a couple of things can happen. If that one animal takes out their stress on the other animal, what we know is the animal who has the stress taken out on it does far worse than the animal who expresses its stress towards the other. What the other part of it said is that if the animals are given some sense of control, whether it's perceived or real, over the stressor. So imagine for a moment that the stress is giving the animal a shock, and that a light comes on 10 seconds prior to the shock, and that there's a lever in the cage that that mouse can press or that rat can press, even if it has nothing to do with the shock, that action of pressing the lever shows in the system that the stress has less impact. And then the final thing is, after those two animals might be shocked, if they go over to the corner and they do grooming and console each other, what we see is a significant reduction in the physiological and psychological aspect of how stress is impacting. So what does that mean? What it means is the research says that there really are three key things that we want to encourage people to do in response to stress. Number one, having a healthy outlet for frustration. It's not necessarily screaming at another person within the ECC or taking it out on your family. It's having a healthy outlet for the frustration. Giving people a sense of predictability and control also will help them reduce their stress response. And the final one is a perception of life improving by having social supports in place. So if you think about what it is that you want to do in emergency management to help reduce the effects of stress, outlet for frustration, giving people a sense or having a sense of predictability, control, and feeling like you're not in it alone is really, really helpful. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll turn this back over to Emily.
Jeff. Wait for my, there I am. All right, thank you so much, Jeff, for that great presentation. I really appreciate it. Just so everyone knows, what I am going to be doing is I am going to be sharing the full bilingual slides as we go through the question and answer. That's just so it's available so that when you watch the video again, you would have the full bilingual available to you. So I'm just going to start doing that now. Give me one moment. Perfect. So I have started to share that for you now. Now I do ask that our other panelists, if they would come back on video and on mic, we can start our question and answer period. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, and I really appreciate that. We are going to start off with one opening question, and that question is, within your own organizations, so this is for the panelists, within your own organizations, what have you done to reduce or manage stress? So I'm going to start with Josh on that one.
Sure. Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks, Jeff, for that great presentation. One of the things that we're doing within our organization is at the start of every meeting, we have everybody post into the chat of the meeting, how you're feeling, and whether it's green, yellow, or red. And the idea is really just to be able to do a temperature check of who's in the room, and allow people to sort of give an overview of how they're feeling, how they're working. And what we're doing as leaders on those respective teams is when somebody says, they're yellow or they're red, we make a note of it, potentially prompt a question to be able to share and really increase engagement with people. But then also as leaders, you essentially have two currencies during a crisis. And the first one really is information and sharing information. So being open and transparent as much as possible. But the second one is empathy. So being able to then go back, and anybody who said that they were red or orange, because they didn't want to say that they were red, you're able to go back and connect with them afterwards and really follow up and do that, provide the support that they're going to need.
Thank you, Josh. Let's start next with Jennifer. Same question.
Thanks. One of the things that we've done that I think has helped is we've started using Teams, and not something that we had ever used in the Emergency Operations Center before. But one of the benefits of that has been the ability to have the virtual meetings and being able to see each other. When people are working from home, there is that increase in connection. So while we started out doing that, trying to solve another problem, I'm seeing that it's helped with that connection, which seems to definitely be assisting with managing stress.
Jennifer. Jason, last word to you on this one.
All right, well, thanks for the presentation, Jeff. And to add on to the other panelists with Joss and Jennifer, what I would contribute is that in our Emergency Operations Center, we try to use a peer support mechanism where we are actively kind of looking for signs of anyone in our Emergency Operations Center that may require some extra time. Some of the things that we've done is take more breaks and just the acknowledgement every so often of the hard work that people are doing and the recognition of the stresses, so that we're not stereotyping or putting a bias on that, we have to, pull through this hard, or, so I think it's the peer support and the recognition and removing the biases that it's okay to not be okay. We've said that, we've talked about that, and I think that's been a part of the help. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this is to start the proactive measures to be able to build that resiliency that Jeff talks about. So I'm very excited that we can do this. So a great opening question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Jeff, I do have a question aimed to you. We do have someone from the audience interested in hearing more about the idea of compassion fatigue and how that can start affecting you during times of stress like this.
Yeah, I think that anybody in a helping profession is really prone to be focused on other people's needs and can really be blinded to their own needs. And that's really where compassion fatigue comes from, that the focus on getting the job done that serves the community distracts from that individual's really ability to focus on what they need to do to get through. And it really is, I like to sort of say it's having no gas left in the tank, despite the fact that you got 10 more miles to go. And you're so focused on filling up everybody else's tank, you haven't pulled aside to stop at the gas station and refill. And that really is what compassion fatigue is. I think that as has been discussed, is working on teams or peer support can really be an active measure of reminding people to pull over and fill up their tank so that they can continue to do the job.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. Now, I do have another question that I'm going to direct to all of you, actually. And this is, it can be a tricky question for sure, but how do we create a culture in our organizations that builds resiliency when people in that organization don't feel sufficiently supported by their leadership? I'm going to start with Jeff first, just to give us a general idea.
Well, I think that first of all, that we know that organizations do have within their structure some challenges, those organizational challenges, and there's a lot of research on these organizational aspects that respond to stress and what people can do. I don't really want to get into that because I can't make an organization change, and I don't know anybody out there that can. But what I would recommend is that we focus on changing how what's going on in the organization impacts us. That's what we have control over. And so being able to say, how is what's going on in the organization impacting me, and what do I need to do to cope with that stress, I would say is probably going to get better results than continuing to try to make the organization change to meet your needs.
Jason, I'm going to turn that question over to you, and you can give us advice from your experience.
Sure. So I think organizationally, for our city, the recognition from the emergency management lens that our hazards are becoming more complex, just the intercomplexity in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and what we considered in the beginning a medium level of flood risk. We had to recognize early on that there was going to be those stresses coming on our city employees, and then the recognition early on that there was going to be a requirement that we were going to have to team up, and we knew that we were going to have a bit of a battle. So I think for us, we do feel the support, but I do think the problem that I see in terms of dealing with how disasters are becoming more complex and causing more stress on emergency managers is when we look at the efficacy of our operational periods and how we are dealing with staffing our EOC is that there isn't enough of everyone. So operationally, we need to be able to look at those issues to be able to have more depth on the bench. And sometimes depth on the bench isn't going to be an issue. So I think it goes back to the recognition and making sure that we understand that we're going to get into it, and it is going to take a long time, and we are going to need to do that resiliency building and be proactive. So I think it comes full circle back to the original question around what are we doing so that we can continue to build on that. And it's sort of like the weakest chain in the link. And if we aren't doing something proactive, and we would like to do more proactive work here in our city on our mental health and wellness for our emergency management team, and I think this is a good start. So
thank you very much, Jason. Josh, you're next.
I think that this is a great opportunity to actually lead up, and if you are responsible for a team and you're feeling that you're not quite enabled, or your team is having some stress, that there's an opportunity to go to your boss and say, right, hey, this is what we're doing to support mental health on our team, and to be able to support and encourage resiliency within our team. It might be something worth rolling out to the other direct reports of your boss. And then the other thing is you can also go to your peer network and say, right, this is what we're doing on our team. Are you guys seeing this sort of same thing? And start building that culture of resilience from the bottom up, and then be able to sort of adapt it at your level and down, but also all the way across your organization, and have it filter up so that it becomes something that is flagged to the senior leadership.
Jennifer, you're the last word on this.
Thanks. I think one of the things that we've found is that talking about organizational support is that sometimes between the ECC, or Emergency Operations Center, pardon me, and the organization, I mean, sometimes there are some differing opinions, and part of recognizing that is literally saying, okay, we ran into that wall and we need to take a U-turn or do something different. And so we found that just recognizing when you've run into that wall and being able to sort of talk about it and put it into context of, okay, we need to shift, really helps to deal with that, sometimes what can be like a bit of a conflict.
That. All right, so our next question is, working virtually has changed lives for a lot of people, including a number of emergency managers. How do we create the same level of support that we might normally have if we were at work? And I'm going to get Jeff to start on that one for me.
Well, I think leveraging just what we're doing right now, just the uptake in using technology, the being able to connect virtually, to ask the question. And one of the things is maybe just asking a different question when you're more distance or virtually. I think that we all can ask the question, how are you doing? And there's a reflex reaction of fine. So I would ask people to consider virtually asking a different question that actually gets a realistic answer rather than a reflective answer. I think that we're seeing in about 125 different organizations that I work with that ability to reach out and check in and that openness. Some are saying, and in a conference call yesterday that we had with a team, that the norm is being able to almost make it more systematic to check in and ask the questions than when people were more face-to-face and passing in the hallway, that the effort actually comes out of the distancing and the protection measures. And what we're trying to do with the people we work with is, how do you keep that momentum going so it doesn't get lost once the restrictions and the openness happens? So I think it takes intentionality. I think it takes leveraging what you're already using and seeing the benefit, but most importantly, ask the right question, because how are you doing will get you fine. Ask another question that really gets to the core of what you want to know, and then that person is likely to answer in an honest way.
Jennifer, do you have anything that you've used in your organization to help bridge that virtual gap?
I think we've had more meetings, virtual meetings. Initially, we didn't have that in place. So by bringing in more meetings, each day, that allowed the different teams to at least be able to have some discussion, touch base with each other, instead of everybody working so much in isolation.
Jason, is there anything that your organization's been doing?
So I think it's the recognition that we can kind of get into these silos where, we're in a box. I'm looking at the screen right now and there's 4 of us in a box, and you look a little lost for the connectivity sometimes when you can't be emotionally connected to someone or in the same room with them. So I think it's important that you recognize that a lot of the conversations that we have that allow people to feel empathy and to connect with one another are happening in person, so that when you're in the hallway after the meeting and you're like, yeah, I recognize what you said there, I want to talk to you about that, and you get an opportunity to connect with someone. We lose those opportunities in these virtual meetings because we all know we can go from our 12 to 1 to 1 to 2. There's no travel time. There's, in some ways, the new virtual reality of working in an EOC online and through webs and team and all these aspects has taken out those opportunities to connect with people. I don't know if it's been effective. I think it has been, but one of the things that I do is I try to either add some anecdotes about what's happened in my day, or ask people about how their day is doing, or tell me something about what's going on that isn't work related, and make sure that while you still want to have work effectiveness and performance, you still give time for people to be able to talk about their dog, or you still give time for people to talk about and normalize what else is going on around in their world. And I think that's important. And as we move to this new normal, with potentially using things like Teams and web-based platforms and go-to webinars and things along that line, I think we're going to need to be able to adapt and make sure that we can still connect with another. I don't want to lose that ability to connect with people. Some of the best conversations I've had where I've been able to figure out if someone's doing okay is, after a meeting where everyone's sort of breaking up and you get that opportunity to have that one-on-one. We're not doing that quite as much anymore in this virtual world. And I think that we're going to have to figure out how to build that resiliency back in.
Josh, last word to you on this one.
I think it really comes down to empathy and being, like Jeff said, the intentionality and actually being intentional about connecting with people. What's different about COVID and the environment that we're in right now is, I remember the Fort McMurray wildfire. Working in Edmonton, supporting Fort McMurray, couldn't directly relate to that environment, but we're all impacted in similar ways. We've been disrupted physically. We can't go to our favorite coffee shop right now. We've been disrupted cognitively. We knew where we were going January 1st, and now we don't necessarily. We've been disrupted psychologically. We felt powerful. We knew what we had planned for this year way back in January or even February. And now, there's that uncertainty, and we're not necessarily in control like we were. And then, we've been disrupted emotionally. Many people have gone from really hopeful at the beginning of the year to a little bit disparaging and feeling some of the stress that Jeff was talking about. And we can all relate to that. So in many ways, being intentional about connecting with people and being open to connect and have that emotional intelligence and providing that empathy and that empathetic ear is absolutely critical, because we can all directly both empathize and sympathize with people's circumstances.
Perfect. Thank you, Josh. So we are just running into the end of our time here. I am going to provide each of you just an opportunity for any final thoughts on the topic that we had today. So I'm going to start with Jennifer.
Thanks. I think this is such an important topic, and it's I'm so glad to see that there's more attention being placed on the emergency management field and how the stresses are impacting that group of people, and the fact that we have all these different individuals who come into the emergency operations center who may not normally be in there. And I really appreciate the fact that this is about the preparing people and helping them have that baseline to help them respond to it. And I think we've got some really good tips here today to help us with that, but we're going to have to continue, especially in the light of COVID, at looking at how we manage those supports for each other as we go on.
All right, Josh, you're next.
There's a saying that the best time to plant a tree for shade was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And really, we have an opportunity now to start building resilience, to talk about this, to have these conversations. And this is critical to it. And for everybody who's on the webinar and watching the recording afterwards, take the key lessons and go back and have these discussions with your teams and start the conversation, because this is really how we build resilience, not only for ourselves and for our teams, but for the spider web of connections that they're going to have with their families and their other colleagues and coworkers and friends. So really take the opportunity now to start building that resilience and practicing all of the recommendations that Jeff put forward, and do what you can to support each other as we go through this, because it's a bit of a roller coaster, and we will all get through this together.
Don't know whether we've lost Jason there. I apologize.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Perfect. So just last words to you.
Okay, thank you. I guess just to add on to what the other panelists are saying, and a big thank you for Jeff for providing an excellent presentation. I think it's about recognition. In my city, in our municipality, we've dealt with a lot of emergency management hazards that we could see coming from a long ways off. Floods, you get the weather, it's coming in, and you can prepare and things like that. This was COVID-19 for me was something that when we saw what was happening in Europe and we started coming across into North America, we recognized quickly that we were going to have to, as Jeff said, batten down the hatches, and you want to tighten everything up beforehand. And I think the thing that we probably didn't talk about earlier enough was how we were going to prepare our emergency management teams for some of the stresses that may appear, for some of that advanced planning, for some of the things that we saw that folks were doing and having to respond to in other countries. And I think that moving forward, we've recognized that emergency management needs to grow, keep learning and adapting. And if we don't think about our mental health and wellness early enough, the way maybe other response organizations as police, fire, EMS, military, and security forces do more on a more regular basis and provide that proactive lens to be able to build that resiliency, I think we're going to struggle. So I think that the message for me here is to start building those proactive resources so that we can strengthen our ability to rebound. And I just want to say thank you to Jeff and for everyone. So.
Thank you, Jason. Jeff, I'm going to give the last word to you on this one.
So there's 2 points that I want to bring out. First of all, that in emergency management, public safety personnel, you're not just dealing with COVID-19. You're not just dealing with the flood or the fire. You're dealing with life stresses. You're dealing with aging parents. You're dealing with financial stresses, layoff, economy. And I want to really remind people that don't automatically presume that it's just COVID-19 and your role that is impacting. Don't just assume, ask. Taking on educating your kids, no daycare, fighting for toilet paper, all that sort of stuff, that while you do impacts you, life still is impacting you beyond that, and ask those questions about how people are doing beyond the emergency. The other thing is that sort of takes that from SARS and MERS, what we actually found out is the reintegration period, when things start to open up again, can actually be another level of stress and a stressor. So don't take it for granted that once this emergency is over and the emergency operation centers start to wind down, that it means that the stress winds down. That the vigilance that people are being at to stay healthy and wash their hands and follow the lines in safe way so they're not going the wrong way down the aisle, that's hard to turn off. And the stress continues. And some studies are saying that it can actually continue for months, even years afterwards. So don't just presume that because the crisis is over, the emergency is over, that the people's response, the stress response is over. Don't take that for granted. And that's the final message that I want to say is it doesn't end when we open up this to society and operations again.
Much, Jeff, and thank you again for your presentation today, and thank you to the panelists for your time. We know it's valuable. We want to remind everybody that there is a survey about this town hall that's going to appear as soon as the session is over. A copy of the video will be emailed to all attendees tomorrow. Just a note that CIPSRT does not have permission to share the PowerPoint presentation, but you can contact the individual presenter if you have questions. Our next town hall is going to be on June the 11th, and it is titled Leadership and Mental Health Part 2. This is a special question and answer only town hall that will let attendees ask a panel of leaders questions about developing environments to support mental health. If you have any questions for this session, you can email to the address on the screen, and a link to register for that webinar will be sent in the follow-up email. Again, thank you so much to everybody. Take care and stay safe.